month of the year.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz, and you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. It seems summer has been and gone here in England, and we're left with an aspiring monsoon season in its place. Whilst we're dreaming of sunny days and long warm evenings, the skies are uniformly grey and the rain unrelenting. But it's not all bad. Those broody skies are the perfect backdrop for exploring spooky locations and setting the mood for a ghost story or two. So, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Well, we're turning this episode on its head a little bit and mixing up our usual format because we have a very special guest on the show with us today. There are lots of exciting things coming up, and I hope you'll join us on this paranormal journey. But first, we want to thank our latest amazing patrons:
Tamsin Rich,
Max,
Jez Hollins,
and Marion Welsh,
and Christina Hana and Jessica Noche, who recently upped their pledges,
and Buck, who donated via Coffee.
Thank you guys, and thank you to everyone that's contributed to keeping the show on the air. We really couldn't do it without you.
And with that, we're going to dive straight into this episode. As we mentioned, we have a very special guest with us on the show. I'm sure you all know that we're big book nerds here at Coffee HQ, especially paranormal books. So what could be better than a book of true ghost stories collected and published by one of our very own listeners, Alan Tigwell? We were so excited to read his book, and it did not disappoint. So we couldn't wait to get Alan on the show to ask him all about it. But we've not only got that interview for you this episode. Alan has very generously allowed us to share some of the stories from his book with you on the show today. And without further ado, we'll kick off with a ghost story right now. And this one is from Alan.
I had been contacted by Louise, a lady who owned a house in Lenham Road in Headcorn. She reported to me that she regularly hears someone walking around in her living room late at night. When she comes to investigate, she can never find an explanation. She also told me how small objects are moved around the room and placed in bizarre places. She was concerned that the incidents were starting to become more regular, and although she didn't feel in danger, she was still scared when she heard the noises. In an effort to find a natural or logical explanation for the strange events, she asked if I would come to investigate. A colleague and I spent some time in different rooms of the house, but didn't experience anything unusual, and the noises she had reported weren't repeated. I moved to the living room and set up a trail camera and 2 audio recorders in the room. This type of camera is typically used by wildlife enthusiasts. The self-powered camera is normally attached to a tree, and when it senses movement, a picture or video of the animal is taken. At the time, the camera I was using was motion sensitive and took pictures using a flash in the same way as a normal camera. As with all technology, cameras available today are vastly superior to the one I was using, and there are types of trail cameras where you can even stream live video to your mobile phone. I sat with my colleague close to the only door in the room and waited. At 1:30 in the morning, we heard a muffled noise coming from one of the corners of the room, opposite to where we were sitting. We waited and listened intently, when all of a sudden we heard something fall over and the flash from the trail camera went off. In the flash of light, we both saw a man standing in the corner of the room. He was elderly and dressed in clothes which would be considered from the 1970s. We both immediately stood up and turned on the ceiling light. However, when we looked at where the man was standing, he had disappeared. We checked the room for signs of entry or possible exit, and the only thing out of place was a glass vase which had been knocked over. We checked the footage from the trail camera, and there was no one in the picture of the room. There is no explanation for this, as the camera had a perfect angle of where the man was standing. Discussing the event with my colleague, our descriptions matched and were both confident that we had seen the same spirit.
And I hope that story will serve as somewhat of an introduction to our very special guest, Alan Tigwell, author, paranormal investigator, and long-time listener and supporter of Knock Once for Yes. That story was just one of Alan's own personal experiences, along with many more from himself and other eyewitnesses included in his book, Ghosts in the Garden of England, True Tales of the Paranormal in Kent. Regular listeners may recognise Alan's name, as we previously featured a report he sent us on his investigation of a potential paranormal photo captured at Ainsford Castle, and that was back in episode 17 if you wish to check it out.
We were so excited when we discovered that Alan was publishing a book of true paranormal encounters, and we're thrilled to have him on the show with us today to talk about his book, his experiences, his Ouija board collection, and he's very kindly allowed us to share some of the stories from Ghosts in the Garden of England with you today.
So Alan, welcome to the show. We're so happy to talk to you. We've kind of done a bit of an introduction, but would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself, your book, and maybe even about Kent, and why is it called the Garden of England?
Hi, Lil Fitz. Thank you so much for having me on your show. Like you said, I've been a long-time listener. It's great to actually talk to you.
You too.
Albeit over the internet. So, yeah, Ghosts in the Garden of England. Reason I wrote it was ever since I started being involved in the paranormal, going on paranormal investigations and organising events for some of the larger groups in the UK, I've always wanted to write a book. Didn't really have any thoughts aside from that, so it was one of those cases that it's something on your bucket list, something you want to do at some point in the future. I'd always intended it to be on the paranormal, ideally on the local ghosts around where I live, which is in Kent. Live in the centre of Kent. So yeah, that was the primary reason for thinking of writing a book. But as time went on, how these things go, you have a good idea, it never actually comes to fruition.
Yeah.
Over the years, I started collecting other people's books, and the more I read them, the more I'd heard the stories. So they were just a retelling of stories that happened in like the 60s and 70s.
Absolutely.
And, I don't really want to have the same information time and time again. So I thought, well, I've been on a lot of investigations. I've talked to a lot of people about some of their experiences. Let's get in contact with them and see if they are willing for me to share the stories in a book. So that's kind of where how the book was born. In terms of Ghosts in the Garden of England, Kent, it's full of hop farms. It has the nickname as the Garden of England. So that's how the book came into existence.
Fantastic. I completely understand what you mean about there are so many, and I'm sure a great collector of paranormal books, and I love collecting all these Ghosts of Cornwall and Ghosts of Devon, and I hope to get a book from all around England by the end of my life.
That's right. Every time you go on holiday, you get a new book.
I do. I literally do.
She really does.
All three.
And they're all like the same sort of type. Ghosts of Bosworth,
Haunted,
Ghosts of so and so. Ghosts of, they're all the same
Haunted
format.
Nottingham.
Yeah, I wanted to have a name that was different as well, rather than saying
just
Paranormal Kent.
Exactly.
And as you say, they're all old stories, especially when you look back into them, and it's like, this was first written down in sort of 1912, and blah, blah. There doesn't seem to be anything that's current, and that's one of the things I really loved about your book, was that it was almost all current, very fresh.
Yeah. And the other thing I found that it does kind of get my goat a little bit with a lot of these sort of haunted county books is that, especially in my case where I've got like 3 or 4 of them, you find that the stories become watered down over time. Yeah. They've obviously, the author's got it from the first book, and then another author's picked it up from the next book down the line, and another author's picked it up from the book after that.
Agree.
And by the time you get to the 5th book, the story's different.
Yes, I think it's probably something to do with their concerns over plagiarism. You start with the big story, and somebody wants to copy it, so they drop some bits out, change it slightly, and then the next person does that to the reduced story, and over time the actual story itself gets so diluted
It does.
you miss a lot of the information.
You have to backtrack quite a long way sometimes to actually find out what was really going on.
That's right.
So it's really, really refreshing to have this wonderful book full of these contemporary accounts and current stories from eyewitnesses of our generation. It's quite unusual.
That's very kind words, thank you.
And some of the stories in this book are just mind-blowing. And don't worry, you guys, you're going to hear some of them today because, as we said, Alan's very, very kindly offered that we can share them with you. And there's just some crackers in there.
Oh, there really are. There was a few that just, I haven't got words at the moment to describe.
No, but we have got goosebumps.
Yeah, I don't want to give too much away. You really need to read this book.
Yeah.
Now, you say you wanted to be an author for a long time. You've also been a paranormal investigator for a long time. What kind of kicked off that drive for you?
Well, I've always been interested in all things strange, bizarre, ghosts, paranormal, mysteries, and all that type of thing. Ever since I can remember, really. I blame Scooby-Doo. I used to watch it as a kid.
Me too.
Exactly. So I think, it's more of the mystery aspects. It inspires you to go and find and investigate and learn new things. You go to, for instance, a village near me. I've done a few investigations there, but there's certain aspects of that village that just walking through or driving through, you'd completely miss some fascinating history that, for instance, the village I'm talking about is Westmoreland. There's a couple of stories in the book about the village itself, but when you actually take time and immerse yourself in the lifestyle of a place, you learn little bits about the history and the location that are going to get lost over time. For instance, in Westmoreland, there's like an abbey, and the pubs and things go back to like the 16th century and even further back than that. There's fragments of the stone market cross embedded in a little alcove in one of the shops.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it looks amazing. It's only tiny, but it's like the figure of a person, and it's been sort of built into the shop itself. But just walking through the village or just driving through, you'd never see anything like that.
No.
So that kind of kickfires your imagination, and you want to go and learn more things about different places. So for me, it's the mysteries of the places you live that you just never knew anything about.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, it's one of the things that inspired me as a child, because I used to get dragged around all these sort of fusty, tumble-down castles and old halls by my parents who were big history aficionados. And although I loved history as a child, back in the 80s, there wasn't all these lovely displays and information boards and things aimed at children to sort of pique your interest. The information that was available was very dry, and it was very, very scholarly. And I found that ghost stories and all these sort of ghosts of Cornwall and whatever ghost haunted county books were a way into the history for me. They made it exciting, and they opened up this whole world that I just wasn't accessible to me otherwise as a child. It opened up these, like, as you say, these mysteries.
Absolutely. What kind of got me interested in the paranormal aspects of things was I got given a book called Mysteries of the Universe.
Oh, I think I remember that one.
Yeah, there was a series of them. I can't remember the name of the people that published it.
Maybe.
Not sure, it'll come to me in a minute. But they did a series of different books. Mysteries of the Universe had like excerpts from all of those. Part of that was a section on ghosts. And actually later this year, the publishers are actually going to republish the ghost book itself. So
awesome.
I'll try and find that name for you, because I know it's not going to come to me now. But yeah, in the book I got, I think I was like 12 or 13 or something like that, there was a 2-page spread on a village which is in Kent called Pluckley.
Good old Pluckley.
Yeah, good old Pluckley. Anybody that's interested in the paranormal knows certain parts or everything about Pluckley. It was in the Guinness Book of Records in 1989. It's the only village in Britain to have been given that.
Was it the most haunted village in Kent it got the award for, or was it the most haunted village in England? I can't remember. I've actually checked this before
I spoke. It's the most haunted village in Britain in 1989.
What an accolade.
Yeah, 12 ghosts were reported at the time. So whether you believe that is another thing. But yeah, it was a very famous thing back in those days.
Definitely.
Like I said earlier, it's in the days before the internet, and you just couldn't get that kind of information freely available to you. You had to walk to a library.
Yep.
You had to hope there was a book there on
And there was
ghosts,
usually
which in
only
those days
one book on
probably wasn't.
ghosts.
Yeah. So yeah, that kind of inspired me, knowing that there was a place which had so many ghosts in the county that I lived, that just kind of the ball started rolling from there. And yeah, that's kind of how it started when I was a teenager. As I grew up, started going to work, literally the year I started work, I got a car. And that's when I started traveling to these places by myself. Took some friends and other people from work just to kind of give them a bit of a ghost tour. Kind of, in those days, you don't have the kind of events that you have now.
No.
So yeah, from there it developed. Once the internet came around, I found out there were actually clubs and societies that do proper investigations, like the Ghost Club being the oldest group in the world, I think it was.
Yeah.
So I joined them, became the Kent area organiser for their investigations, and just moved around different groups from that. I set up my own group for a while, had quite a few investigations there. Started, rather than going to like pubs and historic places like that, I started getting in contact with the general public and started going to their homes. One of the reasons I wanted to move away from groups like the Ghost Club or other groups like that is because they focused on the historic stories, like very much like what we said with the books. That somebody had a story in 1967, so let's go and pay £100 to hire out this pub. So I wanted to go to places which actually have active paranormal things happening right now. And I don't know, me being me, I just want to help people as well. So going into people's homes with a slightly different investigation style to what was known at that time. And we are talking about 10, 15 years ago, before Most Haunted started on the TV. So it wasn't, paranormal investigation was still in its infancy, I suppose. As soon as Most Haunted came on the scene, it changed the face of paranormal investigation, and it was far more accepted. People kind of knew the type of thing you were going to do at their properties, but they didn't like seeing like the screaming and that aspect of it, the sensationalism. They had real concerns about things happening in their house, as you'll probably read in the book. When you read the stories, you'll see that people contacted me in some instances because they were quite concerned about what was happening to them and their family and their children. So it's one of the hurdles I had to overcome, was explain my type of investigation is not like what you'd see on the TV.
Do you know what? That's something we really don't think about very often, because obviously Fitz and I aren't professional paranormal investigators, and we don't have an awful lot of experience in investigating. But yeah, it's something that doesn't really cross our minds very often. The fact that these TV ghost hunting shows, you know, if you've had paranormal experiences yourself, you are aware that to a certain extent they are for entertainment purposes, and you can't you have to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt, especially some of the ways that they investigate. But actually it could be really damaging for a family that's experiencing something quite traumatic, and they want to get help in, but they are worried because they think that what they've seen on TV with people yelling at ghosts and, you know, calling out demons and all sorts of malarkey, that they're worried that that's going to happen in their house, and of course they're not going to want that.
No,
I completely agree.
The other thing is, we spoke to Keith Linder, who briefly appeared on one of the programs in America, and you'll
know which one.
And he basically wanted some help. He was having activity at his home, and they turned up. They spent, I don't know, 2-3 hours there. It was a night, literally, if that. Said, there's nothing going on, we think you're fibbing, and left. You know, this guy just wanted help with whatever was going on in his house,
and then had to deal with the fallout, which is pretty awful. So that puts you as a paranormal investigator in a really difficult position, wanting to help people and having to overcome these kinds of hurdles before you can even get in there to try and offer some assistance.
To a certain degree, yes. I mean, we're not bashing the TV programs. They are fantastic. Like I say, they changed the face of people's interest in the paranormal, and we wouldn't be in the position we are now without them.
Absolutely not.
like you say, it can come with some negatives in terms of the perception of people when you actually visit them. Anybody that's been on a ghost hunt or a investigation will know a lot of the time you're just sitting around and nothing happens.
Yeah.
There's a fine line between being a paranormal investigator and just sitting in a room like a bit of an idiot staring at a wall.
And of course, we've got to understand from an entertainment perspective, nobody's going to watch a load of investigators sitting in a room with nothing happening for 3 hours.
Exactly. And I've met with some of the people from Most Haunted when I've done some of their ghost hunts, and they're very open about, they have hours upon hours and hours of video where there's absolutely nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
They go to some of these locations and they can't show it because nothing happens with them. That's not to say that place isn't haunted. It's just that it didn't happen when they were there.
Absolutely. And the other fantastic thing about the ghost hunting shows and this kind of modern paranormal movement is that for people like me and Fitz, that aren't with a paranormal investigation group, it's opened up opportunities for us to be able to investigate some of these fantastic locations because of the awareness in popular culture. And in fact, there are quite a lot of historical locations that are now able to supplement their income by letting ghost hunters come in and do investigations. And I do not think that's a negative thing at all, because I'm all for the preservation of historical places. These much needed funds have got to come from somewhere. And what a fantastic way to raise money to keep these places in good condition and available for everybody to visit, be it day or nighttime.
Absolutely. Like you say, it really helps the most places nowadays are businesses. It's all about the money coming in to keep their business running. And I completely get that. So yeah, it's I would say untapped, but a lot of places do this now. But it does allow the people like us, anybody, to go on to these ghost hunts, see what happens. You don't get the full experience of a paranormal investigation on what you call a ghost hunt. There's slight differences between the two, but it's a fantastic way. Even if, with me, my wife is absolutely not interested in the paranormal whatsoever, but she's so supportive. This type of thing would allow a couple to go to have a night out at a place that has some historic significance and will allow you into places that you wouldn't normally see at a time that you would not normally go to. So it's a unique experience. Even if you're skeptic, it's still worth going on these just to experience the property itself.
I would completely agree with that.
Whilst we're talking about wonderful locations, what do you think is your favourite or most memorable?
My most memorable, that would be in terms of paranormal activity and how I supported somebody. It would be the first story in the book, the one at Pennenden Heath in Maidstone. So that one, for me, is the one where I helped make the most change. I'm not saying that anything I specifically did changed it or got rid of anything, but to actually give some suggestions and help people, for me, that's what makes a difference.
That's fantastic. And I've just realised that we need to backtrack a bit, because we haven't asked the question that we ask absolutely everybody that comes on this show. What was your first paranormal experience? Because obviously we've talked about how you had an interest in the paranormal as a child, and then you've gone on to become a paranormal investigator. But at which point did you actually experience something for yourself?
That's a tough one, because I remember seeing things out the corner of your eye, just little things here and there. And most of the time you just put it down to, that thing's moved again, or that looks, I'm sure that was somebody, but actually not too sure, so I'll dismiss it, that type of thing.
Yeah.
You get that happening, whether you're at home or anywhere else. Sometimes it happens. The earliest memory that I can think of just at the moment is to do with a Ouija board. And what happened was I had got sent a Ouija board in the post.
Okay.
To this day, I have absolutely no idea who sent it to me.
Really?
Yeah,
that's an interesting story in itself.
Yeah.
I know. At that time, nobody really knew about the passion and my obsession with this type of thing. And at the time, it wasn't as much as it was now, obviously. So nobody would have known to order that for me or send it to me.
That's crazy.
If they knew that I was into ghosts and that kind of thing, a Ouija board isn't really the type of thing you would just send about. So to this day, I don't know how it was sent to me or who sent it to me. So it just came in the post, had to go collect it from the local post office. And it was just in like a paper envelope. It had come through Royal Mail. And the board was, it's the one that you would normally see with Ouija boards.
The sort of
the one that's
classic
from
design.
The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what it was a colour photocopy or a print that had just been stuck onto a bit of plywood. So it was a copy of the Parker Brothers Ouija boards. In that envelope was just a glass, a tumbler to use as the planchette. But you and I both know sending something like that through the Royal Mail,
post?
a glass with no protection would normally get smashed to bits.
I was going to say, how did it even arrive?
I don't know. It got stopped at the because it was too big to go through the letterbox.
You're not kidding.
Yeah, I had to go collect it, or my dad had to go collect it from the main post office. So I had that. I didn't really use it. I was too self-conscious, I suppose, to use it on my own, and none of my friends were really into that type of thing. So I thought, well, I got one, I'll just put it away. A few years later, or several years later, I was going to move in with my then girlfriend. She absolutely did not want this board in the house. So I thought, well, I got it free, so I'll just throw it away. So I broke it up, snapped it into pieces, and took it down the road into the bin. And I stuck it in the bin because my mum equally didn't want it in the house, didn't know it was there, and she didn't want it going in our bin. So I just threw it in the public bin at the bottom of our road. So back in those days, it was before the internet, so I wasn't aware of the rules that have developed over the years
etiquette,
about don't break it up, don't do this, don't do that, which incidentally have nothing to do with the history of it, and they've just developed through pop culture over the years. So I didn't know any of that, so I wasn't thinking at the back of my mind, oh, I shouldn't have done that. So that night I just went to bed as normal. Halfway through the night, I woke up with what you would describe as a old hag experience or sleep paralysis, depending on your take on it. So, but actually being in that situation, I've never felt anything like that before or since. I've never had that type of experience before or since either. So it's a bit of a coincidence that the very day that I break the board up, that happens. So that was my first kind of proper experience, I suppose.
I mean, I've had sleep paralysis, and I would say that in my experience, it doesn't happen in an isolated way. It's not like, for me, certainly, it's not like you never had it before. There's no signs, there's nothing to incite it leading up to it. When I had sleep paralysis, it was plainly because of stress. There was something causing it. There were signs to indicate that that's what it was, and it didn't happen as an isolated incident. So to suddenly have an experience like that out of the blue for no apparent reason, and to have that happen on the day that you've broken up this Ouija board and tried to dispose of it would be a massive coincidence to me.
Yes, it was. And like I said, I've never had anything like that happen to me since. So I can't explain it. No. But going through that experience was quite terrifying. But as with a lot of these stories to do with that type of experience, it's strange that you just you have the experience, you're frightened, and then you just go back to sleep. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense, and I can't quite get my head around why that happened or why I did that, because theoretically I should be up and finding out what it is.
Well, I don't know, you say that, but I'm thinking back to my first experience, which I was about 11 years old, and you probably heard this story because you listened to the show. Yeah. But I basically saw from my bed an apparition, the first apparition that I'd ever seen. And I didn't get up and sort of, I don't remember kind of wandering around thinking, I must find out what this is. I mean, it disturbed me, but I didn't then sort of go on a hunt to try and solve the puzzle.
I think once it's happened a few times, it's just a case of, well, that happened. You live in a haunted house, and you can have a look, and once you've checked the rooms to see if anybody's there, all the sort of normal things you would do, there's only so much you can do, and you can't just kind of put your life on hold in case it happens again. You just kind of have to go, oh, well, that happened. I need to get some sleep.
And I wonder if you're interested in the paranormal, as I was, and you were, whether that kind of, oh, I don't want to say lend some comfort to the situation, but certainly in my sort of 11-year-old brain, or however old I was, I wondered for a moment, and I was confused and slightly distressed, but at the back of my mind, I was just thinking, I saw a ghost. And my brain kind of put the rest of it to sleep after that. It was just like, well, that was a ghost.
Yeah,
Moving on.
I don't know if it's just that I was a little bit more pragmatic about it, having grown up with, before I can even really remember stuff now, I've had stuff happening like Graham the bum pinching ghost.
Yeah.
I can only remember when he went. I can't remember the early bit because I was perhaps 3 or 4 or something.
No, you've just been told stories by your family about what you said happened.
I've been told the first bit and I remember the last bit. But I think for me, it was just, it happened, there wasn't that drive to investigate like there is for me now. Because it was just stuff that happened.
Just something you accepted.
Yeah, it was just part of the way things were.
Yeah. You've been weird from a very young age.
I've always been very weird. And having experienced sleep paralysis myself, I know it's terrifying. Do you think that experience was probably the scariest you've had, or is there one that really jumps out as being the worst you've had?
That was, I would say, one of the most frightening, or not creepy, but it affected me, and it's one that I remember to this day, and the fear I felt at the time. I think with anybody that does investigations and goes to the events and the ghost hunts and that kind of thing, or even just goes to a public place and has a wander around hoping the place is haunted and that, over time, although you start have the sort of the fear and the nervous energy and the adrenaline running through you when you're doing this or a paranormal event happens, over time you get desensitized to this, and it becomes more of an interest than trying to freak yourself out or get creeped out by anything.
Definitely. I
have found that with paranormal. I suppose it helps me when I'm going to someone's house and I'm talking to them about that. As we said earlier, there's no point getting frightened and running off and that kind of thing. You're there to support and help and investigate. So getting a little bit desensitized to this type of events is positive for an investigator. But one thing I did a few years ago was to try and bring back some of the excitement and that kind of thing, and started doing urban exploring. And in the UK, a lot of the mental asylums that closed down in the 1990s, they're left abandoned, and a lot of them have ghost stories attached to them. There's people telling you about figures being seen in the place, and
definitely we have a local one ourselves. So
so I went to moving outside of Kent here, we're going into Surrey at West Park Hospital in Epsom. It's quite close to Chessington World of Adventures for people who know that more, but it's a massive psychiatric hospital. Most people call it an asylum or that kind of thing. So it was built in 1923, closed in the early 90s, and was derelict by 2003. So we're talking 10 years after that is when I started going. The thing with these hospitals that shut down is that they've been bought up by developers, and they're starting to redevelop it into housing estates. That's what normally happens with this type of thing.
Yeah.
So a lot of that history was going to get lost in terms of the place and how it looks and the environment and how it would make you feel when you're in that environment. But the issue that you have is because they are privately owned now, you have security on site. So any urban explorer will know that you have to get around security. So me and a friend went to West Park, and we knew of the ways to get in through talking to other people. We managed to wander around and experience the place. Now I didn't have any paranormal activity at that time when I was with my friend. And we got caught quite a few times by security because I'm not the fastest. I'm not very good at climbing through small windows or over fences either. So we did get caught a few times and escorted off. And then they started calling the police and that kind of thing. So we thought, well, we're knocked out on the head. Don't want to get caught. But I thought, well, I'll just go back one more time on my own. And that's when these things happened. The feeling of me being alone in this large hospital that's completely derelict, it's I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of this type of place. It's literally as if people just got up and left. Everything was left there, even patient notes.
And somehow that makes it more scary.
Absolutely. And being there on your own, as the night draws in, you can't have lights on because security will see you. Noises, you have to be as quiet as possible. So I was walking around the place, and it's quite a unique structure in the fact that there's large buildings which are separated. So you've got like the women's ward, the men's ward, the children's ward, that type of thing, offices and so forth. And each of these large buildings are connected through corridors. Now, if anybody wants to see what that looks like, just go to Wikipedia for West Park Hospital, and in the gallery you'll see pictures of the actual corridors that I'm talking about here.
Oh, cool.
So they're like outside walkways which are covered. The walls are half plywood, so up to about your waist there's plywood. Then above that it's all windows, just to let the light in. A few of the windows have been smashed through people breaking in the past, and they've been covered up with more plywood, just to make it safe for the people who are like security and the developers. So these corridors are really long. If you start walking down one, security comes round in the distance, you're going to get seen because there's nowhere to go. So I was walking down, heading towards the children's wards, and which is about halfway down. There's the corridor veers off in like a T-junction, I suppose you call it, towards the children's wards. So as I was nearing that, I saw this person walking towards me, and I thought, that's security. So I dashed round the side. I could hear him walking down the corridor, but where the corridor I was in is very short, but it went round in like a curve, and that's where the entrance to the children's ward was. But the thing with the security at that site is that they put some things across the door so that if it had moved, they'd know there were people in there and they'll go and kick them out, basically. Now, I wasn't able to move what they put in front of the door because it was a massive metal bed made of wire and things like that. Plus, there were also some large wooden planks. So I knew I'm not going to be able to move that in time and get in before this person comes around the corner. So I sort of pushed myself up against the wall as far as I could and just hope for the best, really.
Just hid.
Yeah, pretty much. Even though I wasn't hiding, I was just up against the wall. And I could see the person walking down the other corridor through the windows. He wasn't wearing the normal bright yellow security jacket or anything. He was wearing something like a brown suit with like a tie. And I thought, well, maybe it's one of the developer managers, but then why is he not wearing a hard hat or anything like that? Because they have to wear it as a building site now.
Yeah. And
as he walked closer, I could hear him and thought, well, if he comes from this corner, I'm going to get caught. So I either stay here and hope for the best or just go and say, look, I'm leaving. So I thought probably best just to get out of here now. I don't want the police getting called and I don't want to get chucked into prison. Although there's no trespass law in this country, you can get arrested for things like breach of the peace and things like that, which obviously I didn't want to do. So I thought, well, I'm just going to give up and head out. So I walked down and I'd seen him go behind where one of the windows was broken and been boarded up with a bit of plywood. And he'd kind of crossed behind that, which was right at the corner of the corridor. So I just walked down, turned around to say, really sorry, I'm leaving. And there was absolutely no one there. And there's nowhere else in that corridor for you to go. He didn't go back up because I'd still seen him and heard him. So I can't explain where he went. I believe it was a ghost, I suppose you want to call that. But that's one example of that place. Another was it still had the building that had the padded ceiling. And in that building was like an office. And like I say, when people left, they just left all the notes everywhere. And there was like a paper folder which had lots of notes in. And this was the type of folder that had notes stapled to each side of it, so that when you opened it, it fell open and stayed open. So I was just having a quick look through, as you do, and it talked about hearing the patient screaming in the night and all that kind of thing. So read that, turned around, looked at some other bits in the room, and I heard sound like paper being flicked through, and I looked back around and the folder had shut. There's no physical way it could have done that on its own, and I was on my own in that.
No, because if it's got paper stapled to either side, it's weighted when you've opened it. It's not just going to flip shut again.
Yeah, so that type of environment gave me the chills and the creeps, and kind of reinvigorated my interest in the paranormal.
Gosh, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I've got a couple of things that I wanted to ask, and there was something else I wanted to say. With the fear aspect of it, I've noticed sometimes that it's location specific. Like, I've been to some place, I used to be on the other side of the equation.
You used to be the security, well, not quite the security, but the manager.
I used to look after vacant properties,
Okay.
so I was in charge of security. And,
I'm very sorry.
well, there was some, I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so I looked after these buildings, and a lot of the time I'd walk around them. You know, I spent a lot of my day wandering around abandoned buildings, and 99% of the time it was fine, didn't bother me at all. You know, sometimes I was out there late at night and it was dark and what have you, it was fine. Other buildings, didn't matter when I went, the hairs on my arm stood up. I hated being in there, and just an overwhelming fear inside the building.
And
even
you
though
took me to one once, and it was in the middle of the day. It wasn't even an old building, it was like maybe a 60s building in the middle of a sunny afternoon, and it was just, the atmosphere in there was so terrifying. And I mean, we did have a few things happen, a few noises and things like that, but nothing so major as to give you that overwhelming sense of fear. Nothing to really explain why it was so scary just in the middle of the day.
Yeah, it's strange that you say that, Fitz, because, you know, you should be used to that environment. You've been there before, but so you'd get desensitized to it. But to have it happen to you after a while of being there a few times, that's a bit unusual.
Yeah, I mean, some locations were like that. They were a bit creepy, but once you'd been there a few times, you just kind of got used to it. There was one building that used to throw me every time. It was in a sort of star shape, and at the end of each corridor was a mirror, and it was sort of 40 or 60 feet away. And every time you walked out of a room into the big corridor and looked out, you'd see a figure 60 feet away down the corridor, and it'd make me jump, and then I'd realise, idiot, it was me.
Okay.
But there was, like I say, just this one build. There's a couple that were a bit iffy, and it depended on the day or if anything was happening. But there was that one building, no matter when I went, absolutely terrified me. And it shouldn't. It was fairly light and airy. It's only just been finished being used as a doctor's surgery. So it wasn't broken up. It was all in great condition. And it was terrifying. Every time I went in there, I hated it, absolutely hated it, never got used to it.
All right.
And the other thing I was going to say, for the urban explorers out there, as somebody that used to look after these buildings, a lot of the time, if you come to us and say, look, I'd really like to have a look around this building, as long as it's safe, we'll probably be able to organise that for you. If we know that you're, well, first of all, if you're responsible enough to come to us and say, look, I wanted to ask to see if it's possible to walk round, we're going to go, okay, well, obviously they're not fly-by-night. And once we get to know you as well, we find that you're extra security.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
Yeah,
having somebody else around in the building isn't going to hurt.
Somebody that can wander around and go, oh, that window wasn't broken last week.
I'll completely agree with you. In hindsight, being there at this desolate place on my own that was in some parts falling down, some of the floors had gone, they were rotten. If I was there on my own and something happened, I fell through a floor or something like that, nobody would have known I was there. So I completely agree with you. And although security are there to do a job, they can sometimes be a little bit frightening, but they're still human. Like I say, if you go talk to them, you're more than likely going to be able to get a much better experience without the additional fear of, am I going to get caught?
Well, maybe that ghost was actually checking up on you.
Yeah,
see
possibly.
if you were okay.
Absolutely.
Maybe he was warning you away from somewhere that was dangerous. You just never know.
Potentially.
Was that the building that you're talking about, Fitz? Was that the one where you came home where you tried to do an EVP recording?
Yeah.
And he played it back for me, and I could hear him move. He was locking up the building, and obviously something had spooked him. So, you know, being a wannabe investigator, he thought, I'll get my phone out and I'll make a recording, see if I capture any voices. Good idea. So I could hear Fitz moving through the building and locking a door and walking a few paces and locking a door, turning off a light switch. And then all of a sudden, it all went silent. He stopped. Everything stopped. And there was a pause that seemed to hang on forever. And then I just heard thump, 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 as he pelted out the building, slam, 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 doors banging, running. He just absolutely ran out the building, never looked back.
That's hilarious.
So what had happened? You'd seen something, hadn't you?
Basically, it was a weird shaped building. You entered at the ground floor, but it was built into a hill. So there was a back door on the 3rd floor, which was ground level at the rear of the building. And I'd been showing somebody around, they were interested in buying it. And of course, being the person in charge, you're the one that has to go around and lock up the building after you're done. No, this was daytime. It wasn't too bad. And I'd gone round, I'd shown the people out, and I'd locked the front door, and I went upstairs, and it was this creepy building, and I just felt really, really uncomfortable. And I thought, okay, well, if I've got to be here, then I'm going to record it and see if I catch anything.
Yeah.
So as Lil says, I was going around, I was locking the doors, I was turning the lights off, and it was an old people's home originally, so it was set up a bit like a hotel, really long corridor, rooms on either side, and all the doors were open, all the windows were open, so there was just sunlight coming through each doorway. And there was one door which I think was the cleaner's cupboard, and there was a shadow that came out of the doorway, which I just presumed was like a mop in a bucket, or there was something that was in the room that was casting a shadow, and it hadn't bothered me. And I was walking down the corridor, and as I got closer to this room, the shadow moved out of the doorway.
Oh no.
And I just freaked.
You really did.
And I was like,
So to this day, you don't know what happened.
I've got to go past this door to get out. So I just paused. I was like, oh, I can't escape. And I was like, no, I have to do it. And I just ran. And as I looked in, there was nothing in the room that could have caused a shadow. It was an empty room. And I just bolted down the stairs and out of there. I just hated it. Absolutely hated that building. But yeah, didn't catch anything on the recording.
Except you running.
Except me running. But, terrifying. But it's like you were saying earlier, when you get used to certain places, the amount of times I could have gone and I've seen something and I've it's made me jump initially, like, oh, did I just see something? And I think I may have seen something. And you kind of deal with it. That place, I couldn't get over it. Like every time, never got over that place.
Weird.
It's strange how some places make you feel like that, isn't it?
Well, Alan, we've heard all about you and your background, but I think now it's time to share a little bit of your book with the listeners. And we're actually going to share one of my favourite stories, although there are so many awesome ones, it was so difficult to choose. But I'm going to read a story about Kit's Coty House. A bit of a strange name, but Kit's Coty House is a Neolithic monument and a chambered long barrow on Bluebell Hill. A long barrow is basically a burial mound with a chamber inside made of wood or stone. There are several of these long barrows in the area and are commonly referred to as the Medway megaliths. This monument has 3 large stones standing upright, with another large circular stone sitting on top. It's all fenced off and is an English heritage site. In terms of who is actually buried here, no one knows. The general consensus is that Kit refers to someone called Catigern, who was in a battle against the Saxons in 455. On to my story. My 2 brothers and I love to learn about historical places, particularly if they're meant to be haunted. Kit's Coty has quite the reputation for paranormal events, such as the reenactment of battles, ghosts of Roman soldiers, and other folklore. We'd talked about coming here for some time, but had never gotten around to it. My brother was due to leave for university at the end of August, so we decided it was now or never and planned our trip, bundled into my older brother's car. Parking at Bluebell Hill was a nightmare. We had the choice of leaving the car up in a parking area, but then had to walk down the edge of a very busy and fast-flowing road, or squeeze the car in against the side of the lane at the bottom of the hill. We opted for the safer parking area, safer for us, but not necessarily the car. We crossed the road and found the entrance to the footpath up to Kit's Coty. The footpath up to the burial place was steep. None of us are particularly athletic. I hate to say it, but we struggled and were all out of breath quite quickly. We had looked at the site on Google Maps, so knew where we were going, about 1/4 of a mile up the hill to where the stones were situated. It was along this footpath that our experience of something paranormal started. Being the ever-intrepid ghost hunters, we had our audio recorders and video cameras recording our expedition up the hill, just in case we caught anything. And I'm glad we did. As we were nearing the gap in the hedge where we could walk through to the stones, something unexplained happened. I suffer from tinnitus, a medical condition which causes a high-pitched ringing to be heard in my ears, something similar to when a tuning fork is rung. Bizarrely for me, mine comes on or gets worse when there is an electrical field nearby, such as when a TV is on standby mode. As we were getting to the point of the hill where we would veer off the path, my tinnitus started and I had an incredibly high-pitched noise start ringing in my ears. The next thing I knew was waking up after being flat on the floor next to my brothers, who were also apparently waking up at the same time. To start with, we were all in a state of confusion and we just stared at each other, not knowing what had just happened. I saw the camcorders on the ground, still recording us as we gathered our thoughts, stood up and brushed the dirt and dust from our clothes. We grabbed the camcorders and rewound the recording to see what had happened. It turned out we'd been unconscious for about 15 minutes. The recording showed us walking up the hill huffing and puffing with the exertion, and then the video briefly went fuzzy with static, something you don't normally see on modern-day digital recordings. It's at this point we all fall down, all at the same time, and the camcorder hits the ground and falls onto its side. It still had a good view of us lying there unconscious. It's a weird feeling to see yourself doing something you have no recollection of. About 5 minutes later, some sort of mist flows across the path over our bodies and seems to head towards the stones and the field beyond the left side of the path. The strange thing about this mist is that there seems to be differing variations of density, as if some of it was partially solid. It's not something I can explain, and it's difficult to see on the video, but at one point, it looks as though something knocks into one of my brothers and makes his body shift. When we saw this, we looked at him and realised he was holding his shoulder. He pulled his t-shirt to one side and we all saw a red mark and a graze, which he swears wasn't there before, and wasn't the side of his body which hit the ground when he fell. We also rewound the audio recorder to the point where we fell down. We can clearly hear the noises of us falling and the recorder hitting the ground, but nothing else out of the ordinary is on the recording. When we'd collected our thoughts, and as we were practically there already, we decided to continue our journey to the stones. We took a good look around, but there was no mist in the field or around the stones, and we couldn't see anything that would have accounted for our experience. I know people will say that we passed out because we were out of breath, but all of us at the exact same time? I don't think so. It also doesn't explain about the mist and whatever knocked into my brother.
That was an awesome story. Before we get into it, I just have to say that I have that same tinnitus, the electrical tinnitus.
You do, don't you? Yeah, that's how you experience. That's one of your Scooby senses.
Yeah, but I can tell if there's a TV on or on standby or something in another room because I can hear it. It's weird.
I mean, yeah, I have the same. I have the same problem, and I can hear the TVs as well. So I don't know if it's a common thing with tinnitus that it's the TV thing. But yeah, I have it as well. So I can understand where he's coming from.
Have you experienced that in a paranormal sense as well?
No, strangely enough. For me, there's always a low ringing, but it's only when there's a huge electrical current, which I suppose if you're using believe the theories about the electrical currents and the detectors you can get, you would think it would make it worse, but I haven't experienced that yet.
That's interesting, though.
It's always the first time, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, anybody that knows me will realise that one of the reasons I was so excited by this story is because it's a Neolithic long barrow, and I am such a prehistory nerd. And it's always bothered me. We've got so many of these wonderful prehistoric sites around the UK, and they've got so many legends attached to them. And you can understand why. I mean, if you haven't been to one, they're big. They're not little, these long barrows. They're made of standing stones. I mean, we're not talking Stonehenge size, but they're still pretty massive, big slabs of rock. And these kind of megalithic dolmen burial chambers are made of typically like 3 stones that are standing up, and then a big slab called a capstone that sits on the top like a roof. So they're very impressive, very imposing, and so many legends rise up about them because they're just so mysterious. However, whenever you look into these kind of things, I've always been able to dig up a lot of legends about them, but not current contemporary ghost stories. I mean, with the Kit's Coty one, there's tales of sort of ghostly battles, Saxon armies and lone warriors having fights in front of the stones and things like that. But there doesn't ever seem to be much in the contemporary field to kind of root that into something that's current. So to get a paranormal experience from somebody from our generation, something that's actually happened recently, is just amazing to me.
It is a fascinating story, and like him, I cannot understand how they could all pass out at the same time. It's not something I've heard on any other encounter, I don't think. Have you heard of that before?
No, it's a new one to me as well. To have 3 people, young, relatively fit, I suppose, pass out at the same time, there's obviously something that caused that. It's not a medical aspect of each of the 3 people to do it at the exact same time. Something must have happened in that environment to cause this. But what that is, I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of it. The sad thing about that area is that there are actually quite a lot of these Neolithic tombs and other historic sites. But as agriculture in the area grew, farmers blew them up with dynamite and TNT and that kind of thing. So quite close to Kit's Coty, there's another one called the Countless Stones. It's at the bottom of the hill and just across the road. It's, again, quite small, but it's just the remnants of one of these tombs that was blown up to allow easier farming.
Oh, what a shame.
I know.
And the only other sort of not even an explanation, but I could see that somebody trying to come in with logical skeptic hat on could say, well, would there be any sort of, I don't know, gas or kind of environmental influence that made them all pass out? But although this is sort of, I don't know how isolated it is, but it is an English heritage site, as he mentions. So it's something that's visited quite regularly, and I imagine there is a fair amount of footfall there. So if there was anything odd or unusual about the area, any kind of, we don't have swamp gases around here, but you know what I mean, that kind of atmospheric influence that might affect people, that would be a regular thing. It's not something that's going to happen once in, however long people have been visiting this site.
Well, it's on a hill, so you're not going to have anything that's sort of settled or collects.
No.
And it's an ancient monument, so you won't be able to dig anywhere near it. So there won't be sort of subterranean gas, I wouldn't have thought. No,
with the English heritage, they have a variety of different properties that they own. Some you pay to go in, or you have the yearly membership. Others are free because they're outdoors. This is one of the free, publicly accessible one anytime. The hill it's on is part of the North Downs. There is a pub at the top of the hill, and then that's pretty much it. Aside from that, there's fields either side. It's actually in a field. There's, what's the name of the road?
Bluebell Hill?
Bluebell Hill, the one that has the stories about the hitchhikers.
Very famous,
actually, yeah, very famous, about 300 yards away. So there's a couple of main roads that are close, but in terms of the immediate area, it's not blocked off. There's no buildings nearby. There are only farmers' fields. The hill itself, because I actually went there after I'd had the discussion with the person who experienced this, just to find out exactly what it was there, and hoped it happened to me.
Yeah,
unfortunately it didn't. But he's absolutely right. It's quite a steep hill. I almost died walking up it because I'm so unfit.
We would too.
Yeah. Either side, it's one of these ancient trackways that either side there's it's like a cylindrical walkway up the hill. You have banks either side with trees growing up, so it creates a bit like a canopy over you. It's a bit creepy if you go at the right time of the year. Quite steep, so you walk up, and about halfway up the hill there's an opening to the left which takes you to the stones, and English Heritage have a plaque on that just to give part of the history of it. There's nothing in the immediate area that could potentially interfere with 3 people, so I can't explain that one.
No, that is absolutely fascinating. And I'm always on the lookout for these current encounters at prehistoric sites, because it's just something that really, it bothers me why we don't have more experiences coming out of these places. And why do the oldest ghosts that we seem to see, why are they Roman? Why aren't they older than that? And it's something that niggles away at me. So yeah, I'm just searching for these sort of prehistoric ghosts, basically.
Ghosts of dinosaurs. Yeah.
Exactly. I want ghosts of dinosaurs. You're damn right I do.
Yep.
So Fitz, what's going to be your pick of stories to share today?
Well, do you know, I was looking through and there were so many that I wanted to share, and there was one that really resonated with me because it was so similar to the things that we've been having going on here at Coffee HQ recently. So it might not necessarily be the most thrilling story in the book from a sort of like activity sense,
but it is for us because it resonates.
Yeah, but it was so much like what we have going on here that I wanted to share that and get Alan's take on it while we've got him.
Yeah.
Recently, there have been some strange occurrences happening in our house. My husband and I moved into the house in 2002, and we lived there for over 10 years without any problems. But recently, some strange things have been happening which I can't explain. The first time I had an experience, which I would say was paranormal, was when I was sitting in my living room with my sister, who'd come over to spend an evening with us. I was talking to my sister, who was sitting in an armchair next to the door which leads to the hallway, where our stairs to the first floor are. I saw something moving in the hallway behind her, so I turned my head to look, thinking it was my husband, only to see a shadow walk down the hallway from one side of the door to the other. I asked my sister if she saw anything, and she said she hadn't, as she wasn't paying attention to the hall. At the time, I assumed it was just shadows from a car headlight, as the front door in the hallway has glass panels, and basically forgot about it. However, after everything else that's happened, I would now consider this a paranormal event. Over the next few weeks, things started getting even stranger. Literally every day, I would see shadows moving or floating around the house. Sometimes I would look and the shadows would just cross the room in front of me and disappear. Other times, I would stare at one and it would just float off. The shadows would always appear in different shapes and sizes, and it seemed as though they were getting bolder, as it didn't seem to matter whether I was in the room with them. My husband swore he hadn't seen anything, and other visitors to the house seemed unconcerned. I'm sure they were starting to worry about my sanity. One night, I'd been watching Downton Abbey on the telly, and my husband had gone to bed as it really wasn't his type of programme. When it had finished, and I was going up to join my husband, I turned the corner at the top of the stairs and saw a shadow glide into our bedroom. Almost immediately, I heard what sounded like my husband cry out in pain. Although frightened, I ran into the room only to find him in a deep sleep. I woke him up and told him what I'd seen, but he had no idea what I was talking about. There was no sign of injury on him, and he had no recollection of being in pain or crying out. He said he must have had a bad dream, so he got into bed and settled down. It took some time as I was unsettled, but I was starting to drop off to sleep when I was startled by a pressure on my bed down near my feet. It felt like there was someone sitting on the edge of my bed. Then I started to hear a noise that sounded like laboured, heavy breathing. It sounded like someone with a severe chest infection. It had a gurgling sound which caught as it took a breath. I was so afraid, and I held onto my husband's hands and shut my eyes tightly, afraid to look to see what it was. I could hear my husband next to me breathing slowly in his sleep, so it definitely wasn't him. After about 30 seconds, it stopped, and I looked to see nothing there. Since then, I've been woken many times to the feeling of something sitting on my bed, or the sight of something human-shaped standing over by the window. I've heard stories like this where the person has been attacked, but thankfully I've never been, and whatever it is, it seems happy to watch and coexist with us. My husband still thinks I'm crazy though.
That story, when you were reading that, I was just sitting there thinking, this could be words coming out of our mouths when we've been having a conversation about what's been going on at Coffee HQ recently. The shadow figures, seeing things flitting around at the bottom of the stairs. It was like writing the story of our house at the moment.
Yeah, when I started reading it the first time, I was like, yep. You know, after a few years, after he moved in, after nothing happening, yep, at the bottom of the stairs, yep, shadow figures, yep, getting bolder, yep, and it was just, that's precisely what we've been having.
I mean, it's not got to the point yet where we're feeling people sitting on the ends of the bed and things like that, but it's almost like the first chunk of that story is exactly what's been happening here.
So like ticking all the boxes from your perspective.
Literally.
Yeah, and the impression I've got, again, going back to what we were saying earlier, that some things that sort of really make you scared and other things that don't. This doesn't feel scary at all.
I think one of the problems with ghost stories, and it's in human nature, is that we will focus on the scary ones.
Yeah, of course.
The ones that are sensationalized and the ones that give you the creeps. But you don't often hear about ones where it's not a lot happening, but it's frightening to that individual. But when you put it down in paper, it doesn't really come across as a massive, scary ghost story, but it's still real to that individual. So I'm glad that this lady is not the only one that's having that kind of experience. I'm glad that it's not a negative aspect in her life anymore, and that nothing nasty actually happened to her.
No, and that's brilliant that she seems to have sort of not come to terms with it, but they're coexisting. And I think we're doing that here with the things that are going on here. It's not something that we think is negative or scary. We're quite happy to coexist with it. We're more perplexed than anything and interested, I suppose.
Yeah, and all I'm really getting from it is sort of curiosity. It doesn't seem like they're intentionally trying to do anything other than attract our attention or perhaps just see what we are and what we're doing.
Yeah, it could even be like a stone tape theory type of haunting, in the fact that it's just a spirit going through the motions of what happened when they were alive.
Well, it could definitely, in the case of the lady from the story, for sure. As far as our house is concerned, I don't think anybody's died here. There was a lady that lived here before her. She did pass away, but not in the house. And that was really the only owners before us. Now, our house is built on the site of something else, so whether that ties into it, I don't know. But
Well, the other thing, of course, is that the experiences I've had, they've seemed to be curious about me. It's not like they've just been... I've seen some walking around occasionally that could have been along those lines, but a lot of them seem to be looking around the side of the door at me, or there was one that came out of the kitchen and stood behind my shoulder.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like they could see I was there, and it felt like they were building up the confidence to come over and see what I was.
Okay, so it's a bit more like an intelligent type of haunting in your case.
I think
Yeah, and
so.
there doesn't seem to be any kind of communication, and I tried setting up a camera and stuff like that, but the minute I try and do anything about it, it stops. So I don't know whether this might be something with your investigator hat you might be able to help with, whether the act of trying to record something can stop it from happening in the first place or disrupt it.
Not that we necessarily want to stop it from happening.
No, exactly. There's always the potential for that. The thing with the paranormal is that it is all opinion. There is no definitive explanations over certain types of hauntings or anything like that. So as you hear all the different ghost stories, they're all slightly different. The types of entities or ghosts that you'll find look different. Some are shadow, some are white, some are grey, some are see-through, and some are even, they look exactly like a human being walking down the road.
Absolutely.
So they're all different, and anybody that gives you opinions of it, it is just an opinion. So you have to kind of take everything with a pinch of salt.
So have you found in the cases you've been on, because you hear a lot in the media, and I don't think this has been our experience, but on a lot of shows where things get sensationalized, you tend to find that the advice, and again, as you say, this is merely opinion and not necessarily even a good one, that the advice is, oh, don't acknowledge it, don't make contact with it, you'll make things worse. For me personally, I don't necessarily feel that rings true. In this case, anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
I wouldn't personally agree with that myself. I would say that if you are having some kind of paranormal entity reach out to you, trying to interact with you, most of the time it's not a negative one. Mm-hmm. They are rare. In this day and age, everybody blames demons. I don't believe that myself. And again, it depends on your religion as well as to whether it's a demon or a negative entity.
Of course.
But as in the case that I mentioned, the one in Pennington Heath, the first story in the book, I find, and this was evidence of that if you act towards something negatively, you'll get negative back. Which
just makes sense.
Yeah. And then you could also argue that if you're ignoring something, that's a negative act towards it. If you walk into a bar and someone's trying to talk to you and you just ignore them, they don't take that very kindly. It gives
that is a really good point.
That gives you a bad impression of you, and then that's where potentially the negative aspect could come into it. So I would say treat them like any live human being. If somebody or something tries to interact with you in a positive way, like a child, just playfully play back, interact with them. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to increase the activity, and you could actually, by doing that, help them go to wherever they need to go, depending on your belief system. So not everything is negative.
I think that is some really good points there you've made, and I would definitely, that's been our experience, I think.
Yeah.
Well, that was just a small sample of the absolutely awesome stories in this book, and we might just have one or two more for you later in the show, but for now, Alan's got a bit of a special offer for all of you lovely listeners. If you want to tell us about that, Alan.
Yeah, sure. So, like I say, writing this book was just on my bucket list. I'd never looked to try and make any money for it. I personally believe that information should be free. So the book is on Amazon. I always wanted to have a book on Amazon. Unfortunately, with that site, you have to charge for it. It's at the bare minimum. It's 99p for the Kindle version. I think it's $4.99, for the paperback. So for 1 week following this podcast coming out, I'm going to make the Kindle version free for anybody that wants to download it. So get yourself a free book.
That is amazing, and trust us, you want to download this book.
Definitely. So what we'll do, because we release sort of the end of each month, we'll go from the 1st of July for the week.
Yep.
And we'll put links in the show notes and on the website so that everybody can find it nice and easily as well.
Thank you.
But that's not all Alan's got up his sleeve for us today. Alan, tell us about your Ouija board collection.
Okay, so Ouija boards, they've kind of overtaken my obsession in terms of paranormal. So about a year ago, I started collecting them at the beginning of 2018. And although we spoke that I did have one quite a few years ago, I got rid of that. So I've become completely obsessed with collecting the boards. So I think I have about 110 at the moment.
110?
That's not bad going in a year.
Wow.
And I've seen a small selection
my
on
Visa
your
bill,
Instagram.
my credit card's not happy with me at all.
No, I bet it's not. Yeah, we've you can see Alan's collection of Ouija boards on Instagram. It's under the Ouijatorium, and some of my favourites on there. There's a Stranger Things one I love. There's a Supernatural one, which of course is one of my favourites. The Emily Strange one, and a Halloween one. And there's that one that's on.
Ones.
Yeah, you like the cat ones, but there's one that's on 2 tiers that looks like some kind of a cake stand. What's going on with that?
Yeah, that is the hands down the strangest looking board I have in the collection.
Weird.
It's called the Spring Ouija. It's actually a UK produced board.
Really?
Yeah, so it came out just a couple of years ago, actually. There were 2 versions. One is the one that I have, and there's also a pink version for anybody that likes pink. I assume they were capitalising on the Parker Brothers Hasbro pink Ouija that came out a few years ago that's since been removed. But there was a limited edition pink one, which I don't have, unfortunately. But yeah, the collection spans from 1911 up to the current year.
Oh, goodness me, that is fantastic.
Boards from all different countries. So yeah, it's quite a diverse collection there.
So just before we started the show, we were just chatting between ourselves, and I was saying how growing up, I'd kind of heard of Ouija boards, but I mean, I grew up in the 80s, so they weren't available in shops. I never saw one till I was an adult. They were kind of in the public consciousness, but only as much as they existed. They were a bit secret and a bit dangerous and a bit out there, and we all kind of knew we weren't supposed to do them, but we didn't really know why, and we didn't even really know what they looked like, because I remember at a party I went to when I was very young, some girls they thought they were trying to make a Ouija board, but I mean, they'd clearly never seen a Ouija board. So growing up, like, I kind of had this awareness that they existed, but not really what they were. We don't seem to be able to, perhaps we do now, but certainly we didn't seem to be able to get them in brick and mortar shops over here. Is that more the case now? Are they out there in shops?
They are, but not in many, to be honest. I mean, boards have been around since around 1890. That's when the first official Ouija board got its patent. The patent came out in 1891. Ouija is a patent, it's owned by Hasbro. Most of this type of boards are called talking boards. So all Ouija boards are talking boards, but not all talking boards are Ouija boards.
Okay.
And talking boards existed prior to the trademarked Ouija brand, which was bought out by the Kennard Novelty Company at the late 1800s. So Ouija began turn of the century, but there's examples of this type of boards existing in the UK prior to that. Oh. And in fact, the very first patent for a talking board of this nature was in 1854, I believe it was. I found a newspaper article that I can read it to you, actually. It was the Morning Post of the 9th of February, 1854. And it reads, "The psychograph, this ingenious and highly interesting instrument indicating the thoughts of individuals by the agency of nervous electricity, may be seen and tested upon visiting the inventor, Dr. Wagner, at 24 Orchard Street, Portman Square, between the hours of 1 and 5 o'clock. The admission fee, 5 shillings, and the price of the instrument itself is 2 guineas. So that location is actually part of the Selfridges shop in London now.
Oh.
But nobody really knows what that board looks like. But
that was going to be my next question, actually. These sort of very early boards, what I suppose we don't know then what the format is. I was wondering whether they look like this kind of classic, with the planchette and everything that we're so familiar with now.
That one, there have been researchers, the leading researcher, Robert Murch in America. So there's a number of people that we probably should talk about at some point. So there are examples of the patents from this one in particular, plus all of the other boards that have been created over time. Some are very different, this being one of them. You would have plates that you would move, and it then moves like a pointer, a little bit like a spirograph or something along that nature. So that's one example. That was in the shops in the UK, or at this location you could buy that, but I don't think anybody's actually seen, or don't think any of them exist anymore.
No.
So back in the turn of the century, again, looking at the newspapers of the time, they were trying to get producers and distributors of the very early Ouija boards in this country. So they must have at some point being available. But if you come up to the modern day, the last 50 years or so, yes, the branded Ouija board by Parker Brothers was available in UK high street. Gamley's being one of the shops, Boots the chemist being another. I've seen examples of them with the stickers still on for Gamley's.
Wow.
And I unfortunately missed out on that one. I was too slow.
Oh, no.
Yes, so they were available. The earlier one, produced by John Waddington's, was available in 1968 to 1969. I was talking to the daughters of one of the managing directors of Waddington's, and they say Waddington's took it off because of pressure from the church. There was, at the time, immense pressure about the whole spirituality aspect and how it was taking people away from the church. So their argument is that that's one of the reasons it was withdrawn. We talked to other researchers, and they say it's because Parker Brothers took it away from them at that point. In the 70s, there was the same type of board, just slight differences in the design, produced by Palitoy. So Palitoy make toys like Action Man, Star Wars figures, that kind of thing. So
and Ouija boards, as you do.
Yeah, exactly. And Ouija boards just to communicate with the devil and so forth. So yeah, there was another one that I'm still trying to find out information on. This one I know it's available in 1973 because I have the brochure, the trade brochure, which lists it as part of that in 73. But how far beyond that and how far before that, I'm not entirely sure on that one. So still doing research on it. So as of now, can you buy Ouija boards in the shops? No. I've only ever seen boards in one shop, and that's by a brand called Nemesis now. They have a whole range of different types of boards. Spirit boards or talking boards, I suppose you'll call them, because they're not Ouija boards, because they don't own the brand. It was at the Hellfire Caves is where I saw it, in their little tourist gift
I don't
shop
think that was there when we went.
Yeah, it was hidden behind some skulls and other trinkets that you can buy out of the same
we missed
brand.
out on that one, didn't we?
did.
Yeah, pretty sure Toys R Us sold the pink Ouija when that was out a few years ago, but obviously that's defunct now. But in your general toy shop or general high street store, you won't find boards, so you are stuck with the internet. If you're looking for a modern day board, you spoke about Stranger Things.
Mm-hmm.
There's that you would have to go to Amazon for, really. Or eBay is where I spend a lot of my time, particularly if you're interested in getting a vintage historic board. But depending on what type you're going for, you could be spending between 30 quid and a couple of £1,000.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I can imagine, especially with some of these vintage ones. Well, I mean, I suppose my next question would be, do you use the boards, or are they just collector's items for you?
On the whole, I tend not to use the boards from my collection because I'm trying to collect the vintage aged ones. Some of them are quite fragile.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because they're made of plywood, so that's different layers of wood stuck together. Over time, people have stored them in attics and in basements and things like that, and they can become damaged and quite fragile. So, yeah, I try not to, but realistically, yeah, I'll have a quick go and see what happens, if anything. Some of the boards that I get, once I've got them, I'll then get back in contact with the owners, and if they're a private seller rather than a company like an antique store selling it, I'll ask if they've ever had any experiences, and sometimes they come back and say, yes, this happened, or the house is haunted, that's why we wanted to sell the place, we've smudged it with sage and that type of thing. You have the conversation once you bought a board with somebody, that's when you'll get more information coming from them.
No, fair enough. So we talked earlier about an experience that you'd had with the first Ouija board that you came into contact with, and it wasn't necessarily a great experience. So what then made you think, actually, I'm going to have a go at this?
As in collecting or trying it?
Both.
Okay. So trying it, I suppose anybody that's interested in the paranormal has an inquisitive nature. They want to know what happens. Give it a try. I thought, so I did. I've never really had a lot of... It's not moved by its own. My personal belief on the way, the mechanism in which these boards work, so I don't believe that it's a ghost pushing the planchette. Mm-hmm. If that was the case, you would be communicating with ghosts using your phone. There's, you got your numbers, you've got your alphabet there, you're moving your finger around. at some point. If it's no different between a piece of wood and your phone, really. So
No.
potentially you could be communicating through that. So
it's more of the idiomotor movement kind of
absolutely.
aspect for you. Yeah.
My personal belief is that it's a combination of the idiomotor response and also people who may be open to mediumship and able to communicate. I think if you have both of those two aspects of your personality, then you're more likely to get a response on it.
Well, this is it. And I don't think that there's... by believing that it's mainly idiomotor movement that sort of moves the board, that's not to say that there's nothing paranormal to it at all. Because I think that, like you say, a lot of the times experiencing the paranormal is so much about opening yourself up to the experience and kind of making channels for things to communicate with you or to experience things through. And it's just another tool, isn't it? It's another tool in the same way that an SLS camera is, or a digital recorder is. It's a tool for you to get an experience through. Yes.
For listeners that don't know what the idiomotor effect is, it's basically the scientific explanation of where when you're using a board like this, you effectively tap into your subconscious, and it's your subconscious making small movements, even though you don't realize that you're doing it, that moves the planchette, and it kind of suggests where you move it to, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's part that, and a lot of the time it is purely that. If you go on like the ghost hunts and they use Ouija boards, what happens is that you'll sit down with 4 or 5 different people, and then everybody else will crowd around you and watch what's happening, waiting for it to move. Are you moving it? Are you not moving it? That type of thing. For me, you're not going to get into that meditative state to be able to listen to your idiomotor response, or potentially be calm enough and centered enough to be able to tap into your own thoughts, subconscious.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you there. And we have been on those ghost hunts where there's an awful lot of energy coming at you from the room, but I don't feel like that's going to help you get in touch with your sort of intuitive side that would allow responses to come through you.
I've always wondered if it would be a better sort of way to disrupt that would be to have the people with their fingers on the planchette be blindfolded so they can't see what they're doing. And have somebody else
been,
sort of
experience of that. That has been done before, and generally the words are complete gobbledygook.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's not to say every case is, but when it's been measured scientifically, that's the response. There is no clear words that are coming out.
There's no messages coming out. No.
Yeah. Now, when I looked into sort of Ouija boards and talking boards, I got the impression that originally they were more of a sort of parlor game. It was all very light-hearted, and there wasn't the sort of negative stigma that's attached to them that there is now.
Yes.
When did that sort of change, do you know?
Well, if you look at the original pictures and the marketing, and even if you read the back of the boards of the ones that come out back then, it talks about having 2 participants, a man and a woman preferred. So if you think about the turn of the century, men and women weren't really allowed. It wasn't commonplace to be alone, knees touching, hands touching.
No, there should be a chaperone.
Exactly, yeah. So I think that was part of the draw back in the early days. In terms of the negative stories and aspects that you hear nowadays, most people will blame the Exorcist film for that.
Yeah.
In one of the early sequences, the girl uses the Ouija board, and from there becomes possessed. So people now associate that to be the catalyst for negative aspects and stories about the board. But when you actually do some research, these type of stories have always existed. There've always been people opposed to it, but with social media now, you're far more likely to hear the demonic aspects. I was possessed. Let's sensationalize a negative story for it. And part of that is, I believe, for extra clicks and likes and views. What you don't hear about is where absolutely nothing happens or something positive comes from it.
No, that's very true, actually, because I'm just thinking back to a number of sort of Ouija board stories that we've seen on a lot of the paranormal shows we watch, where they're telling a narrative about, something that's happened in their experience. And so many of them, they literally follow almost a cookie cutter narrative. We did a Ouija board, we didn't close it properly, it all went horribly wrong, we had all this activity happened, and, you know, we blamed it on the Ouija board. We set fire, we tried to burn the Ouija board or break it up and get rid of it, and that made things worse. And you can almost, while you're sitting there watching it, you can go, they're going to try and burn it. That's not going to go and end well for them. Wouldn't do that. Yeah. But like you say, is that, and it happens so often, it then becomes part of our social consciousness that's what happens. If you get a Ouija board, you know, these things are going to happen. And if you try and burn it or dispose of it, it's going to end up back on your doorstep in one piece. And it just becomes a kind of almost like an entity in its own right.
It is pervasive in culture now. And we've said before about the paranormal in general. There's so many people that are like, I don't believe in all that rubbish, but there's a poltergeist in the attic. And it's the same, it seems to be the same sort of thing with Ouija boards. It's like, I don't believe in all that rubbish, but get that Ouija board out. I wouldn't do a Ouija board.
Yeah, I wouldn't touch that Ouija board.
Don't believe it is anything, but I'm not going to do it because it's, you know. Do you find that is what does that sort of bring to you? What do you think of that when people are like, I don't believe in that rubbish, but I'll take that Ouija board away from me?
I've heard you say that before, that people will. You'll talk to people about the fact that you have this type of podcast and you're interested in the paranormal, and they say, oh no, I don't believe any of that. And by the way, there was this one time.
Yeah.
I have exactly the same.
Do you?
With the paranormal aspects and also with Ouija boards. So, you know, people that I talk to about the boards, when I say that I collect them, I have over 100 in my house, you should see their faces. They recoil in horror. So, but then they'll say, oh yeah, I did try it once, and I got in contact with my granddad, and it was a really nice experience. So
I see.
Yeah, the exact same principle happens of what you have with when you're talking about paranormal and things like that. Same happens with Ouija boards, because this type of experience, it could still be considered paranormal.
And I suppose, so do you find then, I guess from our point of view, we just never get to hear the positive Ouija board stories, you know, the ones where either nothing happened or where, you know, something did happen, but it was actually a really positive experience. And they just perhaps, you know, it's like what you said earlier, they're not thrilling, they don't capture the imagination as much, so they just don't filter down to us.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, that type of story doesn't sell as well as one which contains people talking about demons and breaking windows and being possessed. So it, you know, from my perspective, you have more of the positive aspects than the negative ones. And again, I think it depends on your perception when you go into using one of these boards. If you go in thinking, I'm really scared, something bad's going to happen, I'm going to get possessed, what are those eyes in the corner looking at me for? That type of thing, you're going to have a negative experience. But if you go in, see it as an opportunity for, you know, self-reflection, potential to, you know, even if you don't contact someone, then you can help understand where you're coming from with your own personality.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of these tools, I feel the same way about things like tarot cards. Like, even if you're not using it in a paranormal sense, it can still be used as a tool of self-reflection and a window into your own subconscious mind and your thought processes. And I think it's completely possible to use these kinds of tools as not in a paranormal nature at all, but more in an accessing sort of your inner thoughts and feelings and processes and subconscious.
Exactly. I completely agree.
Do you know what, I'd be interested to see, and I've already put out a couple of things on our Twitter and social media about people with their Ouija board stories to get in touch, because we're looking to do an episode with featuring more Ouija board stories next time. What I would be interested now to know is if there are people out there that, like you say, have these positive experiences that just haven't really told anybody, and whether they could get in touch, even if it's just to say, you know, used one, you know, every now and again for 20 years, never had anything bad happen. It doesn't have to be an amazing story, but I'd be interested to see what the proportion is of there's nothing wrong with it to the devil came and ate my baby sort of stories.
That is a really good point, because I think sometimes when we ask people, you know, have you got a story, the responses we get, oh, well, yes, but it's not that interesting. Actually, the stories that people think aren't interesting are some of the most fascinating ones, because they're not sort of classic examples of what we're all used to, of these kind of scary negative experiences. So yeah, let's see if we can get some Ouija board experiences that reflect the other side of this story. That would be fantastic.
And I must admit, I'm not immune myself to the, I don't know about the Ouija board business.
Oh, absolutely.
I've never done one.
No.
And if I had one now, I'm not sure whether or not I would do it. I kind of want to.
I kind of want to, especially now.
I want to experience it, but I'm also kind of like, there's that so ingrained, like cultural, oh no, they're bad, you shouldn't. Bad things will happen if you use one.
But maybe that will help us if we can get some stuff in from our listeners about their more positive experiences. Maybe that will give us that kind of, it's okay to try this kind of thing. Because like you, I grew up being told that it was bad and wrong and you should avoid it at all costs. And I think maybe we need to have something to help us get past that kind of hurdle.
Well, if anybody's thinking of giving a Ouija board a try on the back of this conversation, I would say there's 3 rules, 3 P's of talking boards use.
Okay.
First one being patience, second practice, and third perseverance. So if you just pick it up, give it a quick move around, nothing's going to happen. So you need to be patient with it. You need to try it again and again, get yourself in a good place mentally as well. Make sure you're in a comfortable environment. If you're doing it with somebody rather than on your own, make sure you're comfortable with that person. And also with the board, get one that you're inspired with the artwork on it. I feel that talking boards, it's an untapped artistic expression that a lot of people don't give a try. If you look at all the different types of boards that have come out over the last 20 to 30 years, the design of them, the artwork on it are absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And that's actually one of the reasons I started collecting them. It's not just the Parker Brothers or the Hasbro type boards. I want to collect the ones designed by artists. For example, there's a picture that was drawn for me by an artist that I've had framed and up on the wall. Although it's a print, I suppose you call it, because it's in a glass frame, you can still use it as a talking board. So if you're going to get one that you feel inspired by with the artwork.
That's a really good point, actually. And I think you're right. I think there is so much scope for artistic expression within these boards. That's a fantastic idea. Yeah. And that's some really good advice.
Seeing your collection, there's some amazing artwork in there. I really liked quite a few of them. Now, there was something I wanted to ask you, and that was, there's a lot of, going back to the sort of cultural aspect of these, there's a lot of rules. You say you've got your 3 rules about being patient, and that's fine. What I was intrigued by was you've got these rules like you've got to close the board down, and you shouldn't, that we sort of briefly discussed earlier, you shouldn't break the board, you shouldn't set the board on fire. Do you know where these came from? Is there any sort of reason behind that, do you think?
Well, when you look at the original instructions that came with the boards, they don't mention any of that. What I would say is that developed over time. I mean, talking boards have been around for 130 plus years. So within that time, you're bound to get superstitions about them, or Ouija-stitions, they're commonly called. If it helps you to have a positive experience with the boards, believe them, that's fine. All I would say is the best way to use a board is to treat it as a conversation. You wouldn't walk into a pub and say, is there anybody here who wants to communicate with me? People aren't going to respond to that. It's the same when you're trying to communicate with a board. If you believe in it, that is, say who you are and just treat it as if you're talking to another human being, because depending on your belief system, you potentially could be. Just ask questions as you would normally ask an individual and just be comfortable doing it.
Have you got any suggestions for somebody that might have had a poor experience with a board and is worried about disposing of it, or perhaps not having closed it down properly? Is there any reassurance you think you can give them that would sort of set their mind at ease?
Yeah, send it to me.
I was just going to...
I
knew you were going to say that.
I was hoping you were going to say that.
Send it to Alan.
Yeah, joking, but obviously if people do want any form of support, then you do have a lot of people out there who are willing to help you with the board. Although I joke about myself, obviously I am always available if people want support. There is a group called the Talking Board Historical Society. If anybody wants to read more about them, their website is tbhs.org. They're a registered non-profit organisation in America, led by the leading Talking Boards researchers and historians and collectors, Robert Murch being the main one there. Their mission is to research, preserve and celebrate the history of talking boards, and also the women and men behind them. So reach out to them if you can't. Obviously, if you're in America, they are the best people to speak to if you have any concerns. I wouldn't go onto Facebook or other social media saying this, because you're not going to get something positive in response to that. People will either laugh at you or
sensationalize.
Exactly, yeah. To reach out to the people who actually research them, and they will help you.
Very good advice. So what are your plans moving forward with your collection, apart from getting more boards, obviously? Are you planning to sort of display your boards anywhere or write about your boards?
Yes, so there's a few things in the not too distant future, and then long-term plans. Long-term plans, the ultimate goal is to have a small museum of my own.
Yes.
I know, for anybody that hasn't followed the TBHS, or Robert Murch and John Kozik is another key name to remember. They are opening a talking boards museum in Salem, Massachusetts, later this year. Murch has the largest collection of boards in the world. He has well over 1,000 unique boards, so these aren't duplicates, and he has amazing collection, and the quality of them is fantastic. So anybody going to Salem later this year, you've got to check that out. So like I say, the long-term plan is to have some kind of museum. My wife is so supportive of my passion with these. We've actually have a room in our house purely dedicated, the balls room. They are all over the walls, cabinets, and that's purely the purpose of that room, and that's where I store them all.
That sounds amazing.
Short-term plans is that I'm writing a book on collecting talking boards and Ouija boards in the UK, just to try and share some of my experiences, the positives and the pitfalls I've experienced over the last year with collecting them, places to get them, what type of boards, how to repair boards, questioning techniques, all of the different aspects that you'll come up against when you're looking into buying types of boards. So I actually finished the text today. I just need to format it, and then it'll be probably up on Amazon shortly.
Oh, that's
wow.
fantastic.
So it's imminent then. Awesome. Now, we said briefly earlier, and I couldn't quite tell whether we were joking or not, whether anyone that had a Ouija board that they wanted to get rid of, that they could send it to. Is that something that you're actually interested in, people getting in touch with you to give you their old boards?
Yes, if people do want to contact me about boards, there's absolutely no problem with that. I do, on my Instagram, I do ask people if they're looking to sell any vintage or historic boards, get in touch with me anyway. I'm not expecting things for free or anything like that, but I am here to help if anybody has any real concerns over their experiences or do genuinely want to get rid of a board and don't want to throw it away. Particularly with the older boards, because they are considered antiques, I would prefer, and I think all of us would prefer things like that not to be thrown away.
Oh, definitely.
Because they do have a history to them. At some point, particularly with the really old wooden boards, they're very much loved by the people who owned them. So probably not so much in the UK, those type of boards. But yeah, if anybody has any concerns and wants advice on getting rid of a board, get in contact with me. But like I say, the best people for the US, Canada, and things like that is the Talking Board Historical Society. But like I say, I'm here to help.
And even if all you want to do is see Alan's collection of Ouija boards, do go over to Instagram and check out the Ouijatorium.
Yeah, some of them are amazing. I mean, even just the talking board aside, the artwork on some of them is just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, I'm aware that the name can be misspelt quite a bit. So just do a search for my name, Alan Tigwell, and you'll find me.
Are you planning to take your collection anywhere? To any events?
Yes, that is the aim for sort of any time from now, really. I'm trying to find events that would be willing to have a mini exhibition of boards. The Talking Board Historical Society has given me permission to have an information table about them in the UK. So again, I'm just trying to find a suitable venue or event that suits me in terms of times when I can get to it and suits them in terms of the type of event it is, really.
That's fantastic. Well, if you do get anywhere, please do let us know, because I think we'll want to be there. So are there any plans to make your own board?
Yes, Lil and Fitz will know I tend to drag my heels with a lot of things. I am making my own. I did design, the artwork is done, and I've been testing how best to get it onto the actual board itself. So I do have some that have been produced that the intention behind making it is, I'm not the type of person to look to want to make money out of this type of thing. I was going to give them away as part of my Instagram at some point. I just need to do a few things in terms of making a planchette and that type of thing before I'll be giving them away, basically.
I can't wait to see that when it's finished.
And if people want to get in touch with you personally about Ouija boards, is there a way that they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, so if anybody wants to talk or have concerns or anything like that, there's two ways you can get in contact with me. Firstly, like we've spoken about, my Instagram feed, that's where all I put on that is my collection. So you can contact me through Ouijatorium. Just search for Alan Tigwell and it will come up with that. Just message me through that if you want. Alternatively, if you have a ghost story you want to share with me, if you're in the southeast of England and want me to come and, speak to you about something, the email address is myghoststory@yahoo.com. More than happy to help out with anything there. But what I would just say is, on the internet, there's a lot of false information about talking boards and that kind of thing. So if I just give you, there's 4 sites that I would recommend people going to look at. First one we've already spoken about, which is the Talking Board Historical Society. Their website is tbhs.org. The next one is Robert Murch's website. He's the leading researcher and collector of talking boards. His website is williamfuld.com. And on that, you'll see all the patents and the full history of Ouija. Gene Orlando, he had the very first website to do with Ouija on the internet. It's called the Museum of Talkingboards.com. On that, you'll see all manner of different boards on that. So if you're interested in the artwork, I want to see the variety of boards that have been available over the years, that's the one to go to. If, however, you're a fan of the planchette, so that is the thing that you move, the little table you move to the letters, Brandon Hodge is the best person to take a look at his site. His site is mysteriousplanchet.com.
That's fantastic. And that's really valuable information as well, because like you say, if you are concerned about Ouija boards or you're just thinking of having a go, it's so difficult to trawl through the internet and find the actual, well, I don't want to say facts, but the good information, the helpful information. So that's really, really good information to have.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing those. Like you say, it's brilliant that you've got something that you can go to, which is effectively from the horse's mouth. People that have researched this, that know what they're talking about, that have dug into the history of these things, rather than just my Aunt Sally raised a demon when she used a Ouija board.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to have to wrap up now, or we could sit and talk to you all night, Alan, but we won't take up any more of your life.
I waffle a lot, so don't worry.
No, it's all been really, really interesting, and we have loved having you on the show. It's been so fantastic. So just before we wrap up, just remind everybody of the title of your book and where they can find it. We will be posting on social media and on the website about this offer where they can download it for free after this episode comes out. So just remind us of the title and anything else you want to wrap up with.
Okay, thanks very much. And firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this podcast. It's been my favourite podcast since you started, so it's a true honour for me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So the book is by Alan Tigwell, that's me. It's called Ghosts in the Garden of England. That's what you need to search for. And like Lil and Fitz say, it'll be free. I think Amazon allows me to do it for a week. So from the day after this podcast comes out, I'll be making that free for anybody that wants to download it and have a read.
And you definitely should. There are some cracking stories in there.
Literally, I'm not even joking, I couldn't put it down, and the goosebumps were just up and down and up and down. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Alan, and I hope we will speak again soon. Do let us know your plans for the future for the Ouijatorium, and let us know when you've finished your new book. We can't wait.
I will do. Thank you so much.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that interview as much as we did, and a huge thank you to Alan for joining us on the show. Don't forget that his book, Ghosts in the Garden of England, True Tales of the Paranormal in Kent, will be free to download from Amazon from the 2nd of July for 5 days, and you don't want to miss out on this opportunity.
No, we'll post the links for Alan's book and all the resources you mentioned in the show notes on the website. And don't forget, if you have or spot an antique Ouija board, I'm sure Alan would love to hear about it.
And if you've had a Ouija or talking board experience, please do get in touch, and hopefully we can put together a Ouija board story special in the future. But don't think it has to be a scary experience for us to want to hear your story. We'd love to know if people have had talking board experiences that maybe cast a different light on the sinister expectations that's become so familiar.
But don't tune out just yet. We've handpicked 3 of our favourite stories from Alan's book to share with you now. And we're not going to pause and discuss them, we're just going to let you lovely listeners absorb them uninterrupted, so you can immerse yourself in some fantastic true ghost stories. Now, you might want to grab a pillow to hide behind for this first story. It's about a black-eyed child.
I recently saw an article on black-eyed children. They seem to be a popular thing in the world of the paranormal at the moment. The stories reminded me of some strange encounters I had outside a place my wife and I used to rent in Ferndale Road. There was nothing extraordinary about the road or the place we were renting. Just your average road with houses on one side and an enclosed area opposite. I suppose you'd call them gardens. It wasn't a park or anything like that. But it was a public place, and they were opposite our home, so we were glad we could look out of the window at them. We were also very close to the railway line, so it was good to have some greenery to muffle the noise of the trains. One evening, I was returning home from work, and as I was walking up the street, in the distance I saw a girl dressed in a black dress go into the gardens. It was dark and quite late in the evening, so it was a little out of the ordinary to see a girl of what I guess to be 8 or 9 walking around the streets on her own. I was some distance off, so by the time I got to where the entrance to the gardens are, she was gone and I couldn't see anyone. I assumed a parent or someone was already in the garden when I spotted the girl and they'd gone on their way. Bizarrely, I felt a little bit unsettled as I continued to walk past the gardens. I felt goosebumps on my arms, and the air had a chill to it which I hadn't felt before. I couldn't explain why I felt like that. It was as if a certain degree of fear had been conjured inside me. I hurried across the road and into my home. A little while later, my wife got home from her job. Once she'd come into the house and took her coat off, she asked me whether I'd seen the strange girl in the gardens over the road. Since coming into the house, I'd closed the curtains and hadn't looked out. So I went into our living room and took a look out of the window. Sure enough, there was a girl standing in the gardens opposite. It was dark, so the only light was from the streetlights. But they illuminated the gardens quite well, and I could tell it seemed to be the same girl in the black dress that I'd seen earlier. She was just standing there, facing our house. Again, my goosebumps came back and I quickly closed the curtains. I explained I'd seen her earlier going into the gardens, but wasn't there when I walked past. My wife told me that when she was parking the car, she'd seen the girl just standing in the gardens, apparently on her own. My wife is a very caring and loving person who'd do anything for anyone, so she was obviously concerned the girl was alone in the dark and could be lost. So she got out of the car and walked over to her. Standing in front of the girl, my wife had asked if she was all right and whether she needed assistance. My wife explained to me how the girl had just stared at her with huge, dark eyes and didn't answer. My wife had asked a couple of other times before becoming a little scared at how the girl was looking at her, so she'd come into the house. We looked out of the window again and the girl was still there, staring back at us. I said to my wife, we couldn't just leave her there on her own, so we both agreed to go out and see if she would talk to us this time. We left the house together and walked over to the garden where we could see the girl standing. The garden is surrounded by a metal fence, so we were on one side and the girl was on the other. We were only a couple of meters away, so I could see the girl clearly this time. As I saw earlier, she was wearing a black dress and had long black hair to match. Her face had a deathly white pallor to it, but the most shocking attribute to the girl were her eyes. My wife had said they were dark, but seeing her close up, it was clear her eyes were jet black. No pupil, no iris, just pure blackness. There was no emotion on the girl's face and she didn't move as we approached her. She just stared at us. Now, I'm not stupid. I know you can get contact lenses which could explain what we were seeing. But there was just something a little strange about the girl, and it seemed to invoke a certain degree of fear and terror in both of us. As my wife asked in a shaky voice whether she was on her own and needed help, the street lamps around us all shut off and everything was plunged into darkness. We could still see a little because of the ambient light around us, but as we stared at the girl, it was like she was drawn backwards into the darkness, and as soon as she was gone, the lights flicked back on. The garden was empty, and there was no sign of the girl. We went in search with the help of torches on our mobile phones, but we couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. It would have been impossible for her to have exited the gardens without us seeing, and there's no logical explanation for what happened. Over the next few weeks and months, we had regular sightings of the girl, both in the gardens opposite our house and also in the street. At first, we tried to go out and speak to the girl, but she would either be gone by the time we got there, or we would have the same strange situation with the lights shutting off. And after a while, we stopped trying because it was becoming just too scary. We asked our neighbours if they'd seen her or anything out of the ordinary, but they said they hadn't. However, I've since learned there are a couple of other stories in the area which involve people seeing a girl. One of them was near the railway bridge, and in this case, someone had spoken to the girl and actually got a response. In that encounter, the girl said she was going to church and then disappeared in front of the person. Apparently, they'd seen the girl again sometime later down our road, but I don't know whether this was in the gardens where we saw her.
One evening, my girlfriend went to a party at one of her friends' houses. I was due to pick her up once it had finished, but as I'd never met the friend or knew where she lived, although I knew which village, I was going to rely on inputting her postcode into my sat-nav. When it came time to collect her, she sent me a text with the postcode, so I set off on my way, which took me down the M20 towards a village called Leeds. This village is where Leeds Castle is located. I had been there before, so I knew which junction I would have to leave the motorway on. As I was passing the Maidstone junction, I noticed the sat-nav was going to take me off the M20 early and connect me to the A20 which goes through Bearsted. This road runs parallel to the motorway. I knew this was a junction too early, so I was going to carry on and let the sat-nav automatically readjust the route on the way. However, as I neared the junction, I started to feel a surge of anxiety. It's as if something was telling me to get off the motorway. I don't usually have feelings like this, so I decided to trust the sat-nav and followed the route it was telling me, even though I knew it would take longer. About 5 minutes later, I was driving along the A20 and I saw a man in the distance standing on a corner. As I drove closer, I saw he was one of my friends, Alex. At the time, I thought it was strange as he was dressed completely out of character for him. He was wearing smart black trousers, a black shirt and a red tie. Normally he'd be dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. As I drove past, I opened my window and waved and shouted at him, but he just stared at me. His eyes were strange, vacant and emotionless, but they followed me as I went past. I went on my way, feeling a little uncomfortable at the encounter, and the way he'd looked at me as I went past. I soon found the house where the party had been and collected my girlfriend. As we were driving back and about to join the motorway, there was a lot of police activity and we were told the motorway was closed. We had to come back on the same road I'd driven earlier, and I was a little anxious as to whether I would see Alex again. As we drove past the corner where I'd previously seen him, there was no one there. We put the radio on to see if there was any news on why the motorway was closed, and we learned there'd been a terrible fatal accident at the same time I would have been driving along it earlier that evening. The traffic report told us a car had been travelling on the northbound carriageway, but had lost control and had somehow flipped over the central reservation into oncoming traffic. I had never been so grateful that my sat-nav had sent me on a different route. Had I not left the motorway when I had, I would have been involved in the accident. When my girlfriend heard this, I was shocked to hear her say she hoped Alex wasn't caught up in the accident, as he had been at the party with his new girlfriend but had left before I arrived. She described him as wearing the same smart clothes I saw him in earlier. He had made an extra special effort as he was trying to impress his new girlfriend. The next day, we received some terrible news. It was Alex's car that had lost control and caused the accident, and he had been declared dead at the scene. There was no logical reason for me to have seen him standing on the corner of the road I was driving on, or why my sat-nav took me off the motorway when it did. I still can't explain it to this day.
My story dates back to the 1980s and a toy shop called White's Bazaar on Monson Road. The shop closed many years ago, and I believe there's a hardware shop which has taken over the premises where the toy shop was. Although my story is quite old, I wouldn't be surprised if the current owners of the shop experienced something of what we did. When the toy shop was there, it had 2 floors, one on the ground floor and the other in the lower ground floor, where you had to walk down an old wrought iron spiral staircase. There was always a bad vibe in the shop, both before it opened in the morning and particularly at night when we were closing. I suppose the joy and energy of children in a toy shop made things feel better during the day. The first time I experienced the haunting was a Saturday in December. We'd been very busy as people were preparing for Christmas. We'd locked up and were dealing with the takings for the day when we heard a child crying down in the lower ground floor. This was followed by the sounds of a child running and then a muffled thud. Thinking that there was still a customer here, I immediately went down the stairs calling out that the shop was closed. However, when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I couldn't find anyone. I did see a large box of Lego which had fallen to the floor, So assuming this was the noise, I put it back and went upstairs, believing the sound of the child was from outside. Nothing else happened that evening, but we would often hear the sound of children downstairs. Each time we would check, there was no one there except for random boxes of toys that had been moved or thrown to the floor. None of the staff could explain it, and we jokingly nicknamed the spook Legolas, after a character from Lord of the Rings. We called him this as it was predominantly Lego boxes that was moved. Something else that spooked me out was the doll and soft toy cabinet. In the entrance to the shop was a cabinet which had a glass front and contained dolls and teddy bears. They were locked away as some of them were quite expensive. Several times the dolls would be looking one way when we left for the night, and when we returned in the morning, the heads would have been turned towards the door. It was as if they had watched us leave and were waiting for us to return the next day. This was in the days before CCTV, so we never found the true cause of this. We initially thought it was one of the staff who was playing a joke on us, but it soon became obvious it was the dolls that were moving on their own. One day, my friend who also worked there had become increasingly frustrated with the presumed joke and took one of the dolls out of the cabinet, put it back into its presentation box, and took it out back into the storeroom. When she returned, we stood by the till for a while discussing the situation, when she looked up and screamed, then pointed to the cabinet. I looked over and was shocked to see the doll, which she had taken to the storeroom, had returned and was sat amongst the soft toys looking at us. I rushed out back to look in the presentation box, but I couldn't find it. My friend became increasingly obsessed with this doll and was convinced the doll's eyes were moving and would watch her when she was alone upstairs. She became so paranoid about the doll that she actually bought it herself and locked it away in a box in her attic. She was too afraid of it to try and destroy it. I personally don't think the doll was the problem. I believe it was something that was haunting the shop that moved the toys and dolls.
And that is pretty much all we've got time for this episode. We do hope you enjoyed those stories as much as we did. Thank you for joining us on this journey along the path of weird, and we hope you'll join us next episode.
EVP session end.